Hello, dear viewers, and welcome back to Kingdom Principles with Reverend Dr. Mpok. How are you doing? I hope you've been great. So, today let's talk about the consequences of our choices. I like to call it the highway of your choices. Everybody's on a path in life, and sometimes we think that the path we are on is influenced by the background we come from. If you come from a well to do home, if you have people to help you, all that plays a part. But there's nothing like the choices you make. Despite the background you come from, things can change based on the choices you make, either positively or negatively. So let's look at this by examining the life of different biblical characters. Let's start with Samson. So Samson was one of the judges of Israel. Before Israel had kings, they had judges who governed them and helped them in their military campaigns. Samson's parents were initially childless, and the angel of the Lord appeared to his mother and announced that she was going to have a son who would be set apart for God to do exploits. Now, this word of the Lord came to pass. Samson was supposed to be a Nazarite, so that means set apart to God. He was not supposed to take any wine, and he was not supposed to cut his hair. Those were the signs of his Nazarite vow, and his parents made sure that this was done as they were instructed. So he grew up as a Nazarite with long hair, and he had the gift of supernatural strength. Whenever the Holy Spirit came upon him, Samson had supernatural strength. He could kill a lion with his bare hands, and he actually did. So Samson was fighting Israel's battles against the Philistines. That was what he was called to do, because the Philistines were oppressing the Israelites. And so Samson was the deliverer that God raised up to help them. So Samson had one weakness though, and that was for beautiful women. And it so happened for beautiful women of the enemy camp. So he went to Timnah, which was in the Philistine territory, and saw a beautiful lady and wanted to marry her. And his parents were like, aren't there, beautiful girls in Israel? Why do you go to a foreign nation? And he insisted, and his parents agreed. They didn't know that this was of God, because God was looking for an opportunity to confront the Philistines. So during the wedding ceremony, the girl's parents gave him 30 companions. In those days, wedding ceremonies lasted so long, like 7 days. They really feasted. And so Samson decided to tell a riddle to his companions. Let's go back a little bit, and we'll see that Samson had actually killed a lion with his bare hands one day. And that was like on the road. And when he went to where he was going to and came back, he saw that bees had formed a hive in the lion's carcass and produced honey, which he scooped up and ate. So now he decided to tell a riddle to his companions and said, out of the strong, something sweet. Out of the eater, something to eat. What is it? And if his companions got the riddle, he would give them 30 linen pieces and 30 pieces of expensive party wear. So the companions couldn't get the riddle, and they resorted to seeing Samson's wife and asking her to get the riddle from him, which she did. She proceeded to ask him and nag until he told her the answer. She told his companions, and they won the riddle, and he had to give them the prize. And he was very upset about it. He gave them the prize, but then he stormed off. And his father-in-law thought he was not going to come back because he was so angry, and gave his wife to his best man at the wedding. Later, when he had calmed down, some time had passed and he calmed down, he went back to ask for his wife, and he was told, I've given her to the best man at your wedding. And he was more furious. He decided to take vengeance on the Philistines and took foxes, put them in pairs, attached torches to their tails, and sent them into the fields of the Philistines, and they ravaged their fields. And when the Philistines saw what had happened, they got upset and took his wife and father-in-law and killed them. And that made him even more upset. And this time he went out and fought them and killed so many of them single handedly because he had supernatural power. Now, that was one victory. But Samson maintained that love for beautiful foreign women and went back to the Philistine territory, had an affair with a prostitute, and another time went back and this time saw another beautiful woman called Delilah. And decided the enemies, his Philistine enemies, had understood that they could trap him through these beautiful women. So they got to Delilah and said, one man could overpower an army. And so she asked him, of course, he wouldn't tell her. But the more she asked day in and day out, he finally resorted to telling her, unfortunately. He said he was a Nazarite, and the vow he had with God meant he didn't cut his hair since birth. If you did cut his hair, it would signify the end of that vow, and his power would leave him because his power came from God. So when she was sure that he had finally told her the truth, she called in Philistines to hide in the room, got someone to cut his hair while she lulled him to sleep on her laps. And then she shouted, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he got up thinking, he would be as strong as before, but didn't realize the Lord had left him. And with that, his power had left him. As the Lord left him, his strength too left him. So he wasn't unable to overpower them, and they overpowered him. They gouged out his eyes, and they took him to prison where he was grinding grain. And this was so sad, the Israelite hero captured and imprisoned and belittled in such a way. Samson realized the errors of his ways. And while he was in prison, his hair began to grow back. And so it had grown sufficiently long, and he himself had started developing a better relationship with Yahweh, with God. He realized that he couldn't count on his own strength, but on God's strength. So one day the Philistines were having a party and tried to bring Samson out to perform for them. Imagine that, a hero now becoming a clown, a performer. So Samson prayed and said, Lord, grant me strength this one more time. Let me destroy my enemies. And God heard his prayer. And he asked to be put near the pillar of the temple, because they had all gathered in a temple. And God granted him the strength, and he was able to pull down that pillar, and the whole temple came crashing down. And the Bible says he killed more of his enemy Philistines in his death, because it crashed down on him and on them, than all through his life. So it was a sad story, but he came back to Yahweh at the end and got victory from his enemies at the end. But his life did go down because he made some wrong choices. After being deceived by his first wife, he didn't learn from the mistakes. A lot of lessons to be learned here. Samson, we could say, was born with a golden spoon in his mouth. The angel of God announced his birth. He was given supernatural powers by God. He had a mission to fight and overcome the enemies of the Israelites who were oppressing them, the Philistines. And he just had to remain faithful. But his love for foreign and ungodly women brought about his downfall. So that's one story. Now let's look at another story to compare. Not too far from the period, still during the time of the judges before Israel had kings, there was a man named Boaz. Now let's start with the story of Boaz's mother. Boaz's mother was named Rahab, and she used to be a prostitute. In Jericho, when the Israelites were conquering the land, she housed the spies and helped them escape her people. Why did she do that? Because she had heard about the great things their God Yahweh had done for them while they were in the wilderness escaping from Egypt. And she trusted in their God. She said the fear of them had come upon all her people. So she was wise enough to switch sides and join the Israelite camp protected the spies, and they in turn promised to save her when they come to conquer the city, and that they did. And so she married an Israelite from the tribe of Judah, Salmon, and they had a child, Boaz. Boaz was a respectable man, a wealthy man in his time. Now, there was another foreigner called Ruth. She was a Moabite and lived in Moab. And some Israelites, Naomi and her husband and sons, had gone to Moab because there was a famine in Israel. And so her sons married Moabite women, of which Ruth was one of them. She had 2 sons. And unfortunately, her husband and 2 sons died in Moab. So Ruth to Israel because she heard the famine was over. Now, her 2 daughters-in-law decided to accompany her, but she discouraged them and said, you have to go back to your family. Hopefully you'll get new men to marry who will take care of you. But I am just a widow, and I can't promise that when I go back to my country, I'll be able to give you sons to marry. So one of the daughters-in-law went back, but Ruth decided to stay by her mother-in-law. And she said something poignant. She said, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth was a caring and God-fearing lady. It seems like she had believed in Yahweh, the God of her in-laws, and trusted in Yahweh, and loved her mother-in-law. And so with all the virtues that she possessed, she followed her mother-in-law to the land of Israel. And that did not go blindly. Naomi's relatives noticed that this daughter-in-law was a virtuous one, to follow her mother-in-law, and she also loved God. She loved Yahweh, their God. She had rejected her pagan gods because in Moab, they didn't serve Yahweh, they served pagan gods. So Boaz, this descendant of the prostitute who switched sides and joined Israel and repented and served Yahweh, was now a wealthy man, and he also took note of Ruth. In the story, Ruth was sent by her mother-in-law because to go to the field to harvest grain, and Boaz took notice of her and found out that it was a close relative's wife. When there was a widow, the next of kin was supposed to marry her to have children for the deceased. That was one of their traditions, so that the deceased person would have a child to carry on his family name. So Boaz was a family member, but there was someone closer in line to him. So he decided to do the responsible thing and get Ruth a husband. So he spoke to the person who was closer in line to him. The person denied, didn't want to take on the responsibility of Ruth. So he took on the responsibility. That showed righteousness on the part of Boaz. And Ruth herself had proven to be a virtuous, godly woman. Now let's not forget, Boaz was a wealthy man. He could have married any pretty maiden in Israel. He could have refused to marry Ruth, just like the first next of kin did, and passed her on to the third person. But he chose to be righteous, to do what was expected of him, and he chose a God-fearing and virtuous lady who had proven her virtue. And God rewarded both of them. They had a son who was named Obed, and that son was the grandfather of King David. And King David is an ancestor of the Messiah. So you see how God blessed their righteous acts. These were people who were not born as Israelites. I'm talking about Rahab and Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite who integrated into Israel through marriage. Same thing with Rahab, who was even a prostitute and a Canaanite who integrated. So you see, they were not born with golden spoons in their mouth, but their choices put them in the ancestral line of the Messiah of Israel. Their choices. So you see, the path we take is determined by the choices we make, not only the background we come from. The background may help if you let it. Samson had everything going for him, a great background, his birth announced by the angel of God, but his choices took him down a bad path, which didn't end so well for him. But Ruth and Naomi and Boaz chose the right relationships, chose to do things in a godly way, and that gave them recognition such that we can talk about them even up till today. It gave them a family line of kings and the Messiah. So the choices we make matter. And of course, the most important choice is your relationship with God. And the second most, or one of the next most important choices, is the relationship you choose for your spouse. We see that Samson's choice of spouses took him downhill. Boaz's choice put him in the pages of history as an ancestor of the kings and the Messiah. Let's make the right choices today. Let's make the right choices every day. Choices matter. Our choices determine where we get to in life. Remember that. Be blessed. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.